All right, going to make a new section title, and we're going to write down Aboriginal Origins. So I'll make a new section title and write down Aboriginal Origins and then underlined. After you have Aboriginal Origins underlined, we're going to make a bullet and we're going to write down discover. So bullet discover, bullet discover. And the discovery we're talking about, the discovery of Australia by Europeans. It kind of already been found before by other people, like from China, for example. But this is the first time it gets found by Europeans, which is not until the 1700s. Go ahead and make a 1, and we're going to write down last great landmass to be discovered. So 1, last great landmass to be discovered. So it says the last of the great landmasses to be discovered of the large bodies. So of the large landmasses, it's the last big one to be discovered. And that's in the late 1700s by Europeans. Now, it had been found before by people. Humans had already reached Australia, a long time ago. And humans had originally, they had gotten there about 70,000 years ago, was when the first ones arrived. And then a second group arrived 50,000 years ago. So we're going to write down the word arrived. So we're going to write down this word, arrived. So go ahead and make a 2. We're going to write down arrived. And then we're going to write down 70,000 years to 50,000 years ago. So we got 2, arrived, 70,000 to 50,000 years ago. Now, the reason why they were able to get to Australia 70,000, 50,000 years ago was because the sea levels were a lot lower then. They're about 50 meters lower than they are now. So it's like half a football field lower. That meant there was more land that was up. So that meant there was more islands in between what would be Southeast Asia and Australia. And that made it a lot easier to keep on stopping off at islands and so forth and then moving on to the next island. You can see kind of what their boats would look like down here in the picture. So this is kind of what the boats would look like at the time period. So you kind of have the canoe with the, I think it's called skiff off the side there. So it kind of for stability purposes. And that's kind of the boat they were used to travel from island to island. So they basically island hopped until they got to Australia, just trying to look for a place to kind of settle at. Now, the Aborigines, they're the ones that settle in Australia. Go ahead and make a 3 and write down the Aborigines settle in Australia. So the Aborigines are the ones that settle originally in Australia. Aborigine just, of course, means, the original people. So it just means the native people in the area. And generally, the Aborigines, they lived in the desert areas or inland areas, the coast, Tasmania. They pretty much could have lived in any areas of Australia. So kind of lived throughout the areas of Australia. Now, Aborigines that live in the desert, they mainly eat insects, birds, reptiles, and mammals, or ones they can find skittering around. They also eat a lot of fruits. Aboriginal on the coastline, they eat roots, fruits, small animals, reptile, fish, and shellfish. Shellfish are these guys down in the picture. That's what shellfish look like. So Aborigines are natives to Australia and Tasmania, although Tasmania is a part of the country of Australia. They lived there for about 30,000, 70,000 years ago. Generally, the Aboriginals, they have both dark hair and dark skin tone. Go ahead and make a 4. We're going to write down their skin and hair are both dark. And there are a lot of tribes for the Aboriginals. There's about 500 different tribes, so there are quite a lot of tribes of them. So there are a lot of tribes of the area. Go ahead and make a 5. And we'll write down there are about 500 recorded tribes. So there are about 500 recorded tribes. So they do have quite a lot of tribes and such. And we can see the people down here in the picture using body art. We had talked about body art before. So you can see them once again using kind of body art, using a design passed down from their ancestors. So Aborigines, they live in family groups and clans. So that's kind of generally what they live in. You can see another example of rock art down there in the picture. We talked about rock art before, so you see another example of that. Each clan has a place on their land where their spirits return to when they die. We talked about that before, about how the ancestors during dream time created the world, and then they rested in various places in the land once they had completed making the world. They got to protect these places so they won't upset their ancestral beings. So kind of talk about that as well. Then with the hunters, toolmakers, custodians. So we talked about kind of this before, that generally men hunt and then women gather. Go ahead and make a 6. We're going to write down men, equal sign, hunters. And then on the same line, comma, women, equal sign, gathered. So we kind of talked about that before as well. So men hunted, women gathered. Very similar for all the other hunter-gatherer groups that we've seen throughout history. Something unique to this area, though, is they would use dingoes to guard their homes and help men hunt. So very similar to how all the groups are going to start using dogs and so forth. But they're used kind of dingoes from the area. Aborigines were also traders. They traded in stone, shells, boomerangs, ochres. We talked about that before, kind of the paint pigments and yellow paint pigment. So you kind of see various things they traded. Let's go ahead and make a new bullet. And we're going to write down the word European here. So European. Make a new bullet and write down the word European. So Europeans, they find the continent of Australia and they start to arrive physically in the area in 1788. Go ahead and make a 1. 1788, the English arrive. So 1788, the English arrive. So in 1788, that's when they start to arrive into Australia. So that's when they start kind of arriving into the area. And we talked a lot about kind of the painting already, painting on bark and so forth and the various colors that were used. They do have various traditions in music, singing, dance, and art, very similar to, of course, every other group that we've seen throughout history, and in which each one has their own unique things they kind of do in those areas. Now, at the time when Sydney was settled, so Sydney, the city on the east coast there by the British, there were about 300,000 Aborigines in Australia that spoke about 250 different languages. They didn't really have a system of government, because they're all like different tribes and so forth. The British just started to make a move, and just like what happened with the Native Americans, once Europeans started arriving, they started spreading diseases that the Aborigines' immune systems had never developed immunities to. That being like smallpox, measles, influenza, whooping cough, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. Most of those all target the lungs. All right, so like pneumonia, whooping cough, tuberculosis, they all kind of affect the lungs there. So is influenza, and I think so the measles. I think those all affect lungs. Smallpox can kind of spread throughout the body. We're going to write down many Aborigines got smallpox and died. So many Aborigines got smallpox and died. Smallpox was the main one that kind of hit the area pretty hard. Obviously, the other ones didn't help out either, but smallpox is our main one, just like with the Native Americans. So many Aborigines got smallpox and died. So very similar to what happened when they're Americans. They got various diseases from Europeans. It wiped out a large part of the population. They're forced to move from their areas out to other areas, and so forth. So Europeans, they cut down a lot of forests and brought foreign animals to Australia. So in 1780, there were no sheep in Australia. But by the time we get to 1860, there's about 20 million sheep in Australia. Go ahead and make a 3. And we're going to write down by 1860, there were 20 million sheep in Australia. So 3. By 1860, there are 20 million sheep in Australia. Now, a lot of animals became a very big of a nuisance in Australia because their ecosystem had no way of dealing with them. The bullfrog, for example, has become a pretty big problem in Australia. But it's not the only animal that Europeans brought over that became a pretty big problem in Australia. Australia has such a huge problem with one of these animals that they started to construct a long fence, a fence that went from the north coastline all the way to the south coastline, just to keep this animal from spreading around. They even tried to develop a virus that would only wipe out this animal, and it wiped out a lot of them, but then not all of them died, and then they were immune to the virus, and then just kept on rebreeding. So the animal that they had the biggest problem with, they built this huge fence for, was the bunny rabbit. Yes, look at that thing, pure evil. So the problem with the bunny rabbit, it goes around, it eats all the crops up and everything, and there's no animals in Australia that really hunt a rabbit because it's a rabbit. So nothing really in Australia hunts it. So it just kind of continued to reproduce unabated. And it was a pretty big problem. They made a whole bunch of fence and so forth. So you can see right here it says state vermin fence. So the fence kind of runs from the north to the south coast. And it's a pretty long fence. It runs for 1,139 miles. So it runs for a long ways. They kind of completed it early 1900s when they got it completed. You can see it said 1903 at Esperance in the south coast in 1907. So they built this huge fence. Oh yeah, and there's multiple fences. Okay, so you see this one says number 1 rabbit-proof fence. This one that have a name on it. But there's 3 rabbit-proof fences that kind of run on that west coast of Australia. So kind of on the west side from the north to the south. Now, the Aborigines, they were protected by laws in the early 1900s, but those laws that they made to protect them weren't so much about protecting them as it restricted what lands they could own and even who they could marry. So the British had their own idea of something called breeding out. So breeding out is pretty simple. All right, you got someone who's Aborigine, and then they have a child with someone who's British. All right, therefore that kid becomes half British, right? So yeah, again, as said before, they could limit like who you can marry. So when they limited who you can marry, they'd be like, hey, Aboriginal person, you can't marry someone else who's Aboriginal, you gotta marry a British person. And then the person, is 50% Aborigine. Well, then they would tell that 50% Aborigine person, hey, you gotta marry another British person. Well, that person marries another British person, they're only like, 25% Aborigine. So usually how they would kind of want to work this process of breeding out is they would want a kid to get to be about 25% to 12.5%. So they usually want them to get to about 25% Aborigine or 12.5% Aborigine. 12.5% Aborigine was considered what they wanted. 25% though was considered good enough. So you were prevented from the early 1900s to the 1960s. You were prevented if you were Aborigine marrying who you wanted. Again, full-blood Aborigines marry European, half-blood Aborigines marry European. After that, it was considered to be kind of good enough. And that's called breeding out, when you're not attempting to murder off the entire population. Instead, you're trying to slowly breed out the population. In 1967, though, this entire process of trying to breed people out was abandoned, and the Aborigines were made full citizens and given the same rights as everybody else. All right. Let's go ahead and make a. I'm going to say we're in 4. For 1967, the Australians voted the Aborigines real citizens. And once you have that, that's it for today's notes.